She didn't mean to send it. 3 careless words, typed too fast, meant for someone else entirely. I love you. By the time Rebecca Monroe realized her mistake, it was already too late. The message had been delivered, and the man it was never meant for, the CEO of Blackridge Holding. Justin Blackridge was the man no one approached, was standing close behind her in his office, close enough that only she heard him ask, "Care to explain?" One message, one mistake. That was all it took to shatter the balance. If you enjoy emotionally rich stories like this, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. Now, back to where we left off. At Blackridge Holdings, invisibility was safety, and survival depended on it. Justin Blackridge didn't run his company like a man. He ran it like a verdict. Every morning he arrived at 6:45 on the dot. Tailored charcoal suit, white shirt, no tie until he stepped into a meeting. His watch was always on his left wrist, his wedding ring finger bare, his expression carved from restraint. He hated dishonesty the way some men hated weakness. Rebecca had seen him fire a director for misreporting a single line item. She'd watched security escort a project lead out because he forgot to disclose a conflict of interest. Justin didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just went quiet, and then the person vanished from the building as if they'd never existed, which was why Rebecca Monroe dressed like a woman meant to be forgotten. She learned early that attention was a currency, one she couldn't afford to spend. Her life depended on the discipline of knowing everything and revealing nothing. She knew Justin's coffee order because she had learned it by watching him refuse the wrong cup without a word. Ethiopian roast, black, no sugar. 2 ice cubes dropped in exactly 30 seconds after pouring because he liked it drinkable immediately. She knew his gym schedule, 5:10 a.m., private trainer, 40 minutes strength, 20 minutes incline run, because his calendar was a battlefield and she had to protect the gaps like a soldier. She knew he slept in 4-hour pieces and pretended that was normal. She knew the one dish he always ordered at client dinners, steak, medium rare, closer to rare than medium, and if it arrived too cooked, he would not complain. He would simply stop eating. She knew him in ways no one else did, and she never let him know how much. Because Rebecca Monroe wasn't supposed to exist in New York as a quiet assistant in a soft oatmeal cardigan that hid the shape of her shoulders, a plain black skirt that hit her knees without daring anyone to look twice, flats instead of heels, because heels made sound, and sound made presence. Her hair was always pinned in a low twist at the nape, tidy enough to be professional, dull enough to be dismissed. Even her perfume, if she wore any, was something clean and nearly invisible, like soap after rain. Her life was smaller, quieter, a Brooklyn apartment with furniture chosen for function rather than taste. A past she kept carefully folded and locked away. There were things about her name, her history, that had taught her one rule above all others: never let powerful men know how close you are to their world. That night, with her guard down and her shoes kicked off, she texted the one person who knew the shape of her silences, Maeve Collins. Maeve was older by a year and louder by a lifetime, a journalist in Chicago with a taste for chaos. Half sister, half best friend, Rebecca typed with her thumbs and her guard down. "He's a tyrant," she wrote. "Tyrants don't live rent-free in your head unless you've given them a key," Maeve replied. "He controls everything," Rebecca shot back. "And you're secretly in love with him," Maeve answered. Rebecca snorted, embarrassed even alone. She typed without thinking, faster than sense could catch up. "You have no idea how much I love—" She meant to finish it, life, without him breathing down my neck. But her fingers betrayed her. She didn't notice the name at the top of the screen change. Her attention was still on the thought she was trying to outrun, fingers moving on instinct rather than intention. "I love you," she typed. The message sent before the thought finished forming. The contact name at the top wasn't Maeve. It was Justin Blackridge. Delivered, read. Rebecca's lungs stopped working. She deleted it instantly, like deleting could erase consequence. And for the first time in years, Rebecca Monroe understood what real exposure felt like. Not being seen, but being caught. Rebecca arrived at Blackridge Holdings the next morning 10 minutes early enough to breathe in the lobby, smooth the front of her cardigan, and remind her face how to behave. Neutral, calm, invisible. The office smelled of polished wood and expensive restraint. Screens glowed, keyboards clicked. People spoke softly, as if the building itself demanded quiet obedience. Rebecca went straight to her desk, tucked near the edge of the executive wing, close enough to serve, far enough to be overlooked. She placed Justin's schedule folder beside her monitor, aligned the pages, and pretended her hands weren't cold. Justin was in back-to-back meetings until 11. That was normal. The abnormal part was how her body kept reacting to empty air, as if the room itself were about to accuse her. At 11:04, his office door opened. "Rebecca," Justin called, his voice unhurried. "Schedule update." Her stomach dropped so hard, it felt physical. She gathered the folder and walked into his office, carrying his day in her hands. The agenda, the briefing notes, the calls he would forget if she didn't remind him. Everything he depended on without ever admitting dependence. Justin stood behind his desk, suit immaculate, sleeves buttoned, hair combed with ruthless precision. He didn't look angry. That was worse. Anger would have meant emotion, and emotion meant unpredictability. This was control. She ran through the schedule, logistics, deadlines, a reminder that the Carmichael investors were landing at 3:10 and preferred still water, no lemon. She spoke like nothing inside her was collapsing. Justin listened without interruption. His eyes stayed on her the entire time, not her clipboard, not his laptop, her. When she finished, she hesitated, waiting for dismissal. Instead, Justin moved. He came around the desk slowly. He crossed the room like he owned the air in it, because he did. Rebecca held her breath without meaning to. He stopped behind her shoulder, close enough that she could smell him. Clean cedar, black pepper, and something darker underneath. He leaned as if to read from her clipboard, but his mouth wasn't near the paper. It was near her ear. "Care to explain?" he murmured. "The message?" Rebecca's throat tightened. Her pulse hammered so loud, she swore he could hear it. I don't remember," she managed. It was nothing important. She expected the cold judgment, the dismissal, the quiet removal. Instead, she felt the faintest shift, like amusement restrained. "Good," Justin said softly, stepping away as if the moment meant nothing. "Carry on." Rebecca turned her head a fraction, daring a glance. Justin was watching her with a calmness that felt predatory, deliberate, like a man studying the fault line of something he intended to break. And then he resumed the day, as if he hadn't just pressed his finger into the weakest part of her. All day, he did it again and again. A brush of his hand when he took a file. A low, "Rebecca," spoken like a test. A pause too long when she refilled his coffee. Black, 2 ice cubes, 30 seconds after pouring. Every small moment said the same thing. He wasn't angry. He was waiting. Justin Blackridge didn't flirt. Men like him didn't need to. Flirting was a game, and Justin didn't play games. He ran outcomes. People assumed it was ambition that made him feared, but Rebecca knew better. It was his stillness. Because Justin could watch an executive beg to keep their job and remain utterly composed, like the pleading was nothing more than background noise. He could sit through hostile negotiations and never raise his voice. He could reduce a room full of powerful people to silence with a single look. People mistook his silence for detachment, his restraint for indifference. They were wrong. Justin observed everything. He simply chose when to acknowledge it, which was why Rebecca unsettled him. She was too precise, not in the obvious ways, many assistants were efficient, but in the subtle ones. She anticipated his needs before he expressed them. She adjusted meetings around his moods, not just his calendar. She knew when to push and when to disappear, and she never overstepped. That combination was rare. It suggested familiarity. Rebecca moved through the office like someone trained not to leave fingerprints. She dressed modestly, spoke carefully, revealed nothing personal. Yet she knew things about power, about hierarchy, about how men like Justin behaved when they believed they were unseen. Things people usually learned from proximity, not observation. On Thursday evening, Justin reviewed a private dinner menu. He barely glanced at it before speaking. "Steak. Medium rare," Rebecca answered before he could finish. His eyes lifted to her face. A pause. Not long. but long enough. Justin stared at her like he was weighing something unspoken. He never flinched. Except, Rebecca realized over the course of that week, he did flinch, just not the way everyone expected. He flinched at dishonesty, like truth mattered to him as much as air, which was why Rebecca's secret wasn't just risky, it was lethal. She lived in a constant, controlled terror of being exposed, not because people would talk, but because Justin would look at her and see one thing: a liar. Her name on paper was Rebecca Monroe, assistant to the CEO. Her wardrobe was built to blend into the walls. Her apartment was small, her furniture secondhand, her fridge too empty too often. She didn't wear jewelry, except a thin ring she told people belonged to her grandmother. No one knew the ring was actually a signet her mother had worn. Old money, hidden in cheap metal. No one knew she carried shares in Monroe Consolidated that could change board votes with a signature. No one knew her father had erased her. Helena Monroe, her stepmother, had perfected cruelty with a smile. She didn't shout either. She insinuated. She replaced. She rearranged the world until Rebecca no longer had a seat at the table. Rebecca had survived by disappearing, but Justin's attention was a blade. Later that night, she passed his office and saw the lights still on. Justin was inside, jacket off, sleeves rolled, tie loosened. He was reading something with the intensity of a man trying to dismantle a problem piece by piece. Rebecca should have kept walking. Instead, her fingers tightened around the folder in her hands, because she had the strangest, darkest thought. If Justin ever decided she was hiding something, he wouldn't ask what it was. He would wait until it broke her. Her phone buzzed. Maeve again. Has he said anything? Rebecca stared at the message, throat dry, and typed back, no. Then, and somehow that's worse. Rebecca could feel it now, the sense that the accident wasn't over. It had only opened the door. Justin Blackridge did not bring people home. That was the first thing Rebecca noticed when the calendar update appeared on her screen at 6:12 p.m. Location change, private residence, meeting, reconfirmed, attendees, essential only. Essential meant her. She stared at the entry longer than necessary. Justin never blurred the line between work and personal space. He kept his life compartmentalized, sealed off behind glass walls and deliberate absences. If something crossed into his private territory, it was because he had allowed it. Nothing slipped past him by accident. Rebecca arrived at the building 10 minutes early, as she always did. The lobby was quiet, marble echoing faintly beneath her flats. She wore the same kind of outfit she wore every day: muted cardigan, simple skirt, hair pinned low. The elevator rose without sound. When the doors opened, the space beyond felt curated rather than lived in. Floor-to-ceiling windows, clean lines, neutral colors. The city stretched beneath the glass like something owned, not admired. Justin stood near the windows, jacket already off, sleeves rolled to his forearms. He hadn't turned when she entered. "You're early," he said. "5 minutes," Rebecca replied. "You prefer that?" He turned then, slow and measured. His gaze passed over her, not assessing her appearance but her composure, as if he expected nerves and found discipline instead. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward the long table beside the kitchen. Rebecca didn't. Instead, she set her tablet down, opened the files, and began outlining the revised projections. Numbers, contingencies, fallback strategies. She spoke with the calm efficiency he relied on, filling the space with structure so silence wouldn't expand. Justin listened without interrupting. When she finished, he didn't speak right away. He moved, crossed the room, stopping closer than necessary. Close enough that Rebecca became aware of him the way one becomes aware of heat. Presence without contact. Control without touch. "You'll stay," he said eventually. Not a question. "For the Carmichael revisions?" she asked. "For everything," Justin replied. He assigned tasks that required proximity, cross-referencing files at the same table, reviewing contracts shoulder to shoulder, standing behind her to read the screen instead of asking her to turn it. Each time, Rebecca adjusted. shifted, gave him space without retreating. He noticed. "You know my habits," Justin said quietly at some point, not looking at her. Rebecca's fingers curled against the tablet edge. "It's my job," she said. "That's not what I meant," he replied. The words settled between them, heavy and deliberate. "You know when I eat," Justin continued. "When I don't. You know how I take my coffee, how much sleep I get. You know when to interrupt me and when not to." His voice lowered. "You know things people usually learn from proximity." Rebecca held his gaze. "I observe," she said. Justin studied her in silence, his expression thoughtful. Hours later, she reached instinctively for the mug he'd set aside untouched. "You're not going to drink that," she said before thinking. Justin's eyes flicked to hers. A pause. "Why?" he asked. She caught herself just in time. "You don't drink coffee after 9, she said. Another silence. "You remember a lot," Justin said. "I remember what matters," she replied. His mouth curved, not a smile, something quieter. "And that night?" he asked casually, as if discussing numbers. "Do you remember what you wrote?" Rebecca's chest tightened. "I remember deleting it," she said. Justin stepped closer, lowering his voice. "People don't delete things they don't feel," he said. She didn't answer. He watched her then, not her face, but the tightness in her shoulders, the way her breath changed, like a man mapping pressure points. "You don't crack," he said, almost thoughtfully. "Most people do." "I don't have the luxury," Rebecca replied. That earned her his full attention. When midnight crept up unnoticed, Justin finally stepped back. "Tomorrow," he said coolly, "you'll be here earlier." "As usual?" she asked. His gaze held hers. "No," he said. "Closer." The next morning, Rebecca reminded herself that silence was not an invitation. It was a condition. She stepped out of the elevator at precisely 7:01 a.m., laptop bag tucked neatly against her side, posture composed, breathing even. The hallway outside Justin Blackridge's penthouse was quiet in the way only money could afford. Rebecca's pulse stayed steady. It had to. Justin had said closer last night, not with menace or flirtation, like a man altering a process, a new rule. She knocked once. The door opened almost immediately. Justin stood there in fitted black sweater and tailored trousers, hair still damp as if he'd just come from a shower, sleeves pushed up to his forearms. No suit, no tie, no armor. It was the most intimate she'd ever seen him without him doing a single intimate thing. His gaze moved over her, quick and exact. "You came," he said. "It's 7:03, Rebecca replied, stepping inside. "You said earlier." Justin watched her as she crossed the threshold, and she felt it again. The sensation of entering territory that belonged entirely to him. Not just the penthouse, the air, the silence, the rules. His gaze tracked her composure with unnerving precision. Rebecca set her bag down at the long kitchen table and opened her laptop without being told. The habit anchored her. Justin didn't sit. He leaned back against the counter opposite her, arms folded, watching her arrange files with exactness that bordered on ritual. "Start with Carmichael," he said. She did. Numbers, forecasts, risk mitigation. Rebecca spoke in the language she trusted most. Precision. The world made sense when ordered correctly. Minutes passed, then an hour. Justin didn't interrupt. He didn't pace. He simply observed, his attention unbroken, as though her concentration itself were the subject under review. "You've never been married," he said suddenly. Rebecca's fingers paused over the keyboard. "No," she replied evenly. "No long-term relationships either," Justin continued. "No record of one." She forced herself not to react. "I keep my life separate from my work." That wasn't an answer. It was the only one I owe. Justin's eyes narrowed slightly, curious. "You live alone," he went on. "No social media presence, no visible attachments. No history that suggests distraction." Rebecca met his gaze. "Is there a point to this?" "Yes," Justin said calmly. I'm trying to understand you. She exhaled slowly. Then understand this. I don't bring my personal life into the office. That's not what concerns me, he said. He pushed off the counter and moved toward the kitchen island. Rebecca rose to retrieve a document, stepping closer, and suddenly Justin's hands came down on the counter behind her, one on either side, not touching her, but trapping the space. Rebecca froze. The counter pressed lightly into her hips. Justin's arms braced on either side, his body close enough that she could feel the heat of him without contact. She held her breath. Tell me, he continued, what was the delivery date for the Archer North acquisition? Rebecca answered instantly, March 14th. And the pre-brief memo? Submitted February 2nd. Justin didn't move. What about Falcon Ridge? Archived August 19th. Final report sent at 6:03 a.m. You asked me to resend it at 6:05 because the subject line was wrong. Silence. Justin's gaze never left her face. You remember everything, Justin said quietly. Every deadline, every project, every revision. Rebecca swallowed. Yet, Justin continued, you want me to believe you don't remember what you wrote to me. Her pulse hammered against her ribs. The silence stretched. Justin didn't touch her. He didn't need to. His presence alone held her there, caged by intention. Step away, he said finally. Rebecca did, slowly, carefully, as though sudden movement might fracture something fragile. Justin straightened, reclaiming his space with deliberate calm. You're disciplined, he said, controlled, careful. His eyes sharpened. But no one is that careful unless they've learned to be. Rebecca said nothing. Justin turned back toward the table. Work, he said. They continued for hours. At noon, Justin closed the folder and looked at her fully. You don't give, he said. Not to pressure, not to scrutiny. She met his gaze. Neither do you. Then, almost to himself, Justin said, everyone has a limit. Rebecca gathered her things as the meeting ended, pulse only just settling. As she stepped back into the elevator, one truth settled cold and clear in her chest. Justin Blackridge wasn't trying to expose her past. He was trying to find the point where control stopped protecting her. By the third morning in a row, Rebecca no longer paused when Justin's calendar rerouted her before dawn. The earlier hours became routine. Justin worked best before the world intruded. She arrived at 6:52 a.m. this time. The penthouse door opened before she knocked. Justin stood aside without comment, already dressed for the day. Dark suit this time, crisp and exact, the familiar armor restored. But something about him felt different, less distant, more alert, like a man who had stopped waiting for something and started using it. They worked together, yet separately. She spoke, he listened. He interrupted rarely, but when he did, it was precise. He pushed projects across the table without explanation, trusting her to understand why they mattered. And she did, always. At 9:17, a board call came through that should have been delegated. Justin waved it away. You'll handle it, he said, already moving on. Rebecca blinked. It's the Zurich group. I know. You usually take those personally. I'm not today. She took the call without argument, answered questions Justin had never briefed her on, smoothed tensions he hadn't mentioned. When it ended, she looked up instinctively. Justin was watching her, calm and satisfied. You didn't check with me, she said. You didn't need to, he replied. The shift was subtle, but it landed with weight. By midday, he hadn't left the table once. Normally, Justin paced, took breaks that weren't breaks, walks that doubled as thinking time. Today, he stayed. His attention followed her movements, his requests framed with the quiet certainty of someone who expected compliance without needing to ask for it. Rebecca felt the change like pressure behind her ribs. At 1:30, she stood to leave. I'll coordinate the afternoon schedule, she said. You have... Stay, Justin interrupted. I'll eat later. You won't, she replied without thinking. If you don't now, you won't at all. Justin stilled. Then, what do you suggest? She let the silence answer for her. By evening, Justin no longer gave her tasks. He waited for her to anticipate them, and she did. She corrected documents before he finished reading them, reordered priorities he hadn't voiced yet. When a call came in from legal, she answered before he could lift his phone. At 8:06 p.m., Justin set his phone down and looked at her fully. "You've been effective," he said. "I do my job," she replied. "No," Justin said. "It's more than that." Rebecca closed her laptop slowly. "Then what is it?" Justin considered her for a moment longer than necessary. "Reliability," he said. "Predictability." His gaze sharpened. "Control." The word sounded more like a respect than accusation. Rebecca stood. "I'll prepare tomorrow's brief," she said. Justin didn't stop her, but he didn't look away either. That night, in her apartment, Rebecca lay awake longer than usual. Something had begun to unsettle her. The realization came cold and unwelcome. Dependence was forming, and she understood the danger in that more than anyone. Because when men like Justin Blackridge depended on something, they did not loosen their grip, they tightened it. The next day, she arrived to find her desk moved closer to his office, done without announcement or explanation. Rebecca stared at it for a long moment before sitting down. Inside Justin's office, the lights were already on, and for the first time since the message, Rebecca felt something she hadn't prepared for. The quiet, disorienting awareness that the balance between them was shifting. Justin Blackridge began adjusting the workflow in small, precise ways. He changed schedules without telling her. Meetings moved. Calls advanced. Rebecca discovered the changes the way one discovered cracks in ice, by stepping and realizing the surface had shifted beneath her weight. When she asked, he didn't look up. "It's your job to stay updated," he said. So she did. She ran errands stacked atop one another, contracts to legal, documents to finance, a courier run she hadn't made in years. And then, without warning, Justin would appear at her desk with a quiet, lethal calm. "I need a report, now," he said. Which report? He never specified. She learned to infer. Rebecca moved through her workload like a switchboard, managing parallel demands, finishing one task while preparing the next. She corrected errors before they reached the room, absorbed friction before it spread, stepped in where conversations tightened or stalled. "I'll follow up," she told one investor, smiling. "That was my error," she told another, even when it wasn't. Justin watched. He always watched. The moment came during the presentation. The boardroom was full. Dark suits, polished voices, a contract hovering on the edge of possibility. Justin sat at the head of the table, unreadable. The lead analyst presented projections with confidence that thinned under scrutiny. A board member leaned forward. "What's the mitigation strategy if the regulatory window shifts by 60 days? The analyst froze. Seconds passed. The room tightened. Rebecca didn't look at Justin. She raised her hand. "If I may," she said. Every head turned. She spoke without notes, without hesitation, reframed the timeline, adjusted the exposure, offered a contingency that folded risk into leverage instead of loss. The room shifted. Justin said nothing. He watched her dismantle the problem with a calm he recognized instantly, one he used himself when there was no margin for error. She didn't hesitate. She didn't qualify her answer. She resolved it. The board leaned in. Questions followed, and Rebecca answered them all. By the end, the decision was unanimous. Justin felt something far more dangerous than relief, because when pressure hit, she didn't look to him for direction. She became it. He filed the reaction away immediately. Appreciation was a weakness if left unattended. The contract was theirs. Applause broke out, controlled, professional, real. That evening, the board insisted on celebrating. Justin hosted, his home filled with voices and glasses and restrained laughter. Rebecca stayed near the edges, doing what she always did, managing, smoothing, disappearing. She accepted congratulations with polite nods and redirected praise back to the team. When the last voices faded down the corridor and Justin closed the door behind the final guest, silence settled back into the room. Only then did he see her. Rebecca was asleep on the sofa, one arm folded loosely at her side, her bag resting where it had slipped against the cushion. She must have drifted off earlier. Justin remained standing where he was, the room quiet, except for the sound of her breathing. He took one step toward her, then stopped. The urge to wake her came unbidden, the realization to protect her disturbed him more than desire ever had. He imagined lifting her, carrying her down the hallway, laying her on his bed. The thought struck him with its impropriety, its closeness. He clenched his jaw. He had no right, not yet. So he stayed where he was, watching over her sleep like a promise he refused to claim. Minutes stretched, then an hour. When Rebecca stirred, it was sudden, her breath hitching, her body jolting upright as if pulled back by instinct. Her eyes flew open, disoriented for half a second, before locking onto him. Justin hadn't moved. The look on his face was dark, unforgiving. The realization hit her all at once. She had fallen asleep at his home, her face drained of color. "Oh," she breathed, standing too quickly. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to—" She reached for her bag. "Enough," Justin said. She froze. "I know exactly what you're doing," he continued calmly. "Don't insult me by pretending otherwise." Rebecca turned slowly, confusion giving way to unease. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "You didn't just end up here," Justin said. "You didn't just fall asleep. You positioned yourself. You watched. You waited." His gaze sharpened. "You learned me." The words felt like a slap. "That's not true," she said. "I read your message," he replied flat, "before you deleted it." "What?" Her throat burned. "I won't let you manipulate me," Justin went on, voice controlled. "I've seen this pattern before. Assistants who confuse proximity with permission, ambition dressed as devotion." Rebecca stared at him, stunned. "I won't let you play with my emotions," he finished. "Not like that." Something inside her snapped cleanly this time. "You think I planned this?" she whispered. "You think I came here to trap you?" "You came prepared," he said. "You always are." Something inside her cracked. "I didn't expect this," she said. "Not from you." Justin took a step closer. "You don't get to pretend innocence," he said. "Not after that message." She stepped back, just as deliberately, anger finally overtaking shock. "Yes," she said. "I sent that message." Justin stilled. "I sent it by mistake," she continued, each word trembling. "And for one stupid second, I let myself believe it. I let myself believe I cared for you, because I thought you might be worth admiring." She faltered, the next words catching in her throat. She swallowed once, as if forcing them past something lodged deep. Her voice rose, finally breaking through years of restraint. "But you're not," she said. "You're the most arrogant, controlling, emotionally unreachable person I have ever met." Justin's jaw set, control pulling tight. "I cared, okay?" Rebecca said, tears threatening now, but not falling. "And you turned that into something ugly." Rebecca grabbed her bag, hands steady now. "I won't be spoken to like that," she said. "Not by anyone." Silence fell between them. Justin looked at her as if he wanted to say something else, as if there were words pressing against his control, desperate to escape, but control won. Rebecca turned and walked toward the door, her hand closed around the handle. The click of the lock echoed too loudly in the quiet. She pulled. The door moved an inch, then slammed shut. Justin's palm struck the wood beside her head, barely touching her, close enough that the vibration traveled through her bones. "Stop," he said sharply. Rebecca spun around. "You don't get to stop me," she snapped. "I do," Justin shot back, anger finally cutting through control. She tried to step past him. He blocked her, with his presence alone. "You said what you needed to say," he said. "Now listen." "I'm done listening," she fired back. "You've made that very clear." A muscle flickered along Justin's jaw. "You think this was effortless for me?" he demanded. "That I didn't feel it every time you looked at me like that?" "Oh, so that's why you kept pushing me," she asked. His hand closed around her wrist. Not rough, not gentle, urgent, desperate. "You walked into my life and rewired it," he said. "And then you want to walk out like it meant nothing?" Her breath caught. He pulled her closer before she could stop him, just close enough that the anger between them had nowhere to breathe. Rebecca struggled once, then again, then stopped. Justin felt it, the moment the fight drained out of her body, leaving only hurt and weariness. His grip loosened, though he didn't let go. He lowered his voice. "You should have said it to me." Her lashes fluttered. He continued. "To my face." She gave a short, humorless breath. "You would have destroyed me." Did I? He said quietly. The question unsettled her more than any accusation could have. Justin exhaled, his forehead hovering just above hers, close enough that she felt his breath, but not his mouth. I don't function properly when you're not around, he admitted. My days fracture. My decisions slow. The silence gets louder. Rebecca's chest tightened painfully. You think I wanted this? He asked. To depend on someone I can't afford to? She swallowed. Then let me go, she said. His hand tightened again. Just slightly. Stay, he said. Not a command. A request pulled from him against his will. Stay tonight, Justin added. Just don't leave like this. Her eyes searched his face, reading the fracture lines he never allowed anyone to see. Outside, the city moved on, unaware. Rebecca let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hand lifted briefly toward his chest, then fell away again, as if she'd reached for balance and thought better of it. I can't do this tonight, she said softly. I'm exhausted. I don't trust my thoughts right now. Justin nodded slowly, taking the boundary without argument. Then don't decide anything tonight, he said. She stepped back, reclaiming space inch by inch. He didn't follow. I need to leave, Rebecca said. He said nothing. She picked up her bag, movements careful but no longer frantic. When she reached the door, she hesitated. This doesn't mean I forgive you, she said quietly. I wouldn't expect that, Justin replied. She opened the door. He didn't close it this time. As Rebecca stepped into the corridor, the tension that had knotted her chest all evening finally loosened, and she felt her breath return. The door shut behind her with a soft, definitive sound. Justin stayed where he was, the room unnaturally quiet now, aware rather than victorious or abandoned. By the next morning, Rebecca stepped out of the elevator at 7:02 a.m., composed, cardigan buttoned to the collarbone, hair pinned low. Her expression was neutral enough to pass inspection, hers and anyone else's. Her desk was exactly where it had always been, too close to his office to pretend coincidence. A thin stack of files waited, aligned with surgical precision. No note, no instruction. Justin's door was already open. That, she noted, was deliberate. She sat, opened the top file, and began. The morning moved with a discipline she trusted. Calls answered, messages filtered, timelines tightened. She functioned like a machine rebuilt for endurance. Rebecca, he said. She closed her eyes for half a second, then stood and entered his office, placing the annotated file on his desk. Good morning, she said evenly. Is it? He replied, without looking up. I have updated the risk matrix, she continued. The exposure is manageable if we stagger the rollout by 10 days. He read, didn't comment. I wanted to say, about last night, she said. She hesitated, choosing accuracy over comfort. I'm sorry I fell asleep. It wasn't intentional. It was a long day. Justin lifted his gaze then, studying her, as if he were deciding whether to file the apology or discard it. It was, he said. The day progressed with a careful distance that felt rehearsed. He didn't test her, didn't crowd her space, didn't move her calendar without notice. He asked before changing things, waited for answers instead of demanding them. At noon, he stopped by her desk. You're leaving on time today, he said. Yes, she replied. Good. He paused. Try not to fall asleep on any furniture that isn't yours, he added. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, heat rising to her cheeks. He walked away, entirely too pleased. Later that afternoon, he asked for a file she'd already placed on his desk. She stared at it, then at him. It's right there, she said. I know, Justin said. I wanted to see if you'd point it out. You do this on purpose, she said. Do what? He asked. Say things, she said. Then watch me recalibrate like you've tipped the floor an inch. Justin leaned back in his chair, considering her with an expression she hadn't seen before. He looked amused. You're very predictable when flustered, he said lightly. I am not, she replied. You blush when irritated. I do not, she said. You just did, he replied. She opened her mouth, then stopped, furious with herself for proving him right. Justin watched her a moment longer, his expression unreadable again, the amusement fading back behind discipline. For the record, he added, turning back to his screen, you don't owe me apologies for being human. I'll remember that, she said, the reply restrained but deliberate. As she returned to her desk, Rebecca realized Justin Blackridge wasn't merely demanding or controlling. He was precise with people. He knew how to unsettle, how to provoke, how to pull reactions forward like chess pieces, and when to let them rest. A few days later, when the office had settled back into its usual rhythm and the tension between them had learned how to stay quiet, the invitation arrived. It came on heavy cream paper, embossed in gold so subtle it assumed wealth rather than announced it. Private business gala. Black tie optional. Attendance expected. Justin didn't comment when Rebecca placed it on his desk. He glanced at it once, already familiar with the event, then slid it aside. "Prepare the logistics," he said. "You'll attend." She nodded, as always, and walked away without asking questions she already knew the answers to. Rebecca almost didn't recognize herself when she caught her reflection that evening. The dress was understated, deep midnight blue, fitted without excess, elegant without spectacle. It didn't try to impress. It belonged. Her makeup was minimal but precise. Eyes defined just enough to hold attention. Lips softened into something dangerously natural. Her hair was swept back, exposing the line of her neck she usually hid beneath cardigans and restraint. She didn't look rich. She looked untouchable. Justin noticed the moment she stepped into the venue. He had been mid-conversation, posture relaxed in the way only men with power could afford. His gaze lifted and stopped. For a fraction of a second, he forgot to breathe. Her composure, her quiet confidence, the way she moved through the room like she knew where she belonged and didn't need permission to occupy space. Justin realized, too late, that he had been the one not looking before. "Rebecca," he said, when she reached his side. "Yes?" His eyes tracked her once. Slowly. "You clean up well." She arched an eyebrow. "High praise." "Challenging." "Accurate praise," he corrected. They took their seats at a small round table near the dance floor. Music drifted through the air. Live orchestra, smooth and indulgent. Glasses clinked. Deals were made in smiles and silences. Rebecca relaxed, just a little. Then an unfamiliar voice broke in. "Forgive me," said a tall executive she'd met once at another event, smiling far too easily. "Would you care to dance?" Rebecca froze. Her instinct was polite refusal. Her body stiffened as she searched for the right words. She had never been asked like this before. She glanced at Justin without meaning to. That was all it took. Justin stood. He didn't look at the man. He reached for Rebecca's hand. "Actually," Justin said calmly, his fingers closing around hers with deliberate certainty, "she's with me." The executive blinked, murmured an apology, and disappeared. Justin didn't release her. Instead, he pulled her gently toward the dance floor. "You didn't ask," she whispered as they moved. "I didn't need to," he replied. The music rose softly, and as soon as Justin's hand settled at her waist, Rebecca trembled, aware of him in a way she hadn't been a moment before. His grip was firm, but measured, steadying her without crowding, as if he'd already decided how close was enough. His other hand closed around hers, leading her into motion with an ease that caught her off guard. He knew the steps, every turn, every pause. "Relax," he murmured near her ear. She swallowed and tried to steady her breathing as he drew her into the rhythm, her body responding despite her effort to remain composed. "Like this," he added quietly, adjusting her just enough to remind her who was leading. Her pulse betrayed her, and Justin felt it. "You look beautiful tonight," Justin said quietly. Her cheeks warmed instantly. "You blush when complimented too," he added, raising an eyebrow. "I do not," she replied. "You absolutely do," he said. She tried to step back. His grip tightened, subtle, unmistakable. "Don't leave just now," he whispered near her ear. The words slid under her skin before she could stop them. A shiver traced her spine the instant he spoke, her breath turning shallow and uneven, betraying her composure. She bit down on her lower lip, a reflex born of nerves she hadn't felt in years. She couldn't look at him. Instead, her gaze flicked to the room around them, the couples swaying, the polite smiles, the illusion of distance that no longer existed for her. "This is inappropriate," she said, the words weak even to her own ears. "People are watching." "Let them," Justin replied. She lifted her eyes then, unable to avoid him any longer. He was already watching her, waiting just for that moment. "I want you with me," he said. The simplicity of it undid her more than any declaration could have. Her fingers tightened in his grasp. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she already knew, she knew, and that was what frightened her. Because beneath the music and the lights and the steady strength of his hold, something inside her was unraveling. She was standing there, letting this happen, while carrying a truth heavy enough to fracture everything between them. And still, she couldn't deny it anymore. Loving him had been a discipline. Letting herself feel it now felt like surrender. Her voice was barely steady when she spoke again. "You don't understand what you're asking." Justin's thumb pressed lightly at her waist. Deliberate. "Then help me understand," he said. And in that moment, surrounded by strangers and watched by everyone, Rebecca realized the most dangerous thing wasn't that she wanted him. It was that she wanted to believe he would still want her once the truth was no longer hidden. After that night at the gala, something in Justin Blackridge changed. It wasn't dramatic. There were no declarations or changes to his routine. He still arrived before sunrise, still commanded rooms with silence rather than sound, still dismantled problems with surgical precision. But the quiet emptiness he had lived with for years began slowly to loosen its grip. For the first time, Justin allowed himself to admit what had been missing. Rebecca had slipped into his life without strategy, without ambition, without permission. She hadn't tried to impress him, hadn't chased his attention, and yet she had become essential. True love, Justin realized, wasn't loud.
And once he named it, Justin did what he always did when he was sure. He planned. The engagement would not be impulsive. It would be deliberate. He would tell the world that Rebecca was his, without ambiguity, without room for doubt. 500 invitations were sent. Board members, industry leaders, investors, old families whose names carried weight, politicians who smiled carefully, media figures who knew when not to ask questions. It would be an announcement, not a question. Rebecca, meanwhile, felt the opposite. Since the gala, unease followed her like a second shadow. Justin's gaze lingered longer. His presence felt heavier, more intentional. Where she felt drawn, she also felt exposed. Her past had taught her one unbreakable rule. When happiness feels too complete, something is about to demand payment. She became more careful, more deliberate. She avoided intimacy disguised as routine, declined late dinners, redirected conversations that edged too close to personal. When he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either. Justin noticed the restraint and misunderstood it entirely. To him, it wasn't hesitation, it was modesty. A woman unused to being claimed openly. A woman who didn't yet know how visible she was about to become. He mistook her caution for humility, her distance for grace. Then one day, Justin called. "There's a business event tonight. I'll send a car and something to wear." She hesitated. "What kind of event?" "The kind that requires your presence," he replied. "That's all you need to know." She didn't ask anything else. The dress arrived first. Ivory silk, tailored perfectly. Then the shoes, jewelry, everything chosen with a precision that unsettled her, though she told herself it was just Justin being Justin. The car arrived at 7. When she stepped into the venue, the room was already full. Lights low, chandeliers blazing, conversation humming with expectation. And then she saw him. Justin stood at the center aisle, dark suit immaculate, posture unyielding, presence commanding without effort. His eyes were fixed on her, as if the rest of the room had ceased to exist. He moved toward her. For a moment, everything else blurred. "You look..." He stopped, then corrected himself. "Stunning." Applause erupted before she could fully form a thought. She heard herself say yes, felt herself nod, felt the room tilt as the moment closed in around them. Justin slid the ring onto her finger, his touch grounding. He leaned closer, about to seal it with a kiss. "Rebecca." The voice came from behind him, familiar and precisely placed. Time splintered. Cold spread through her veins. Behind Justin stood a woman perfectly composed, her smile elegant and deliberate, like silk drawn over glass, her stepmother. Watching, waiting, ready. Justin remained composed for the rest of the evening. He smiled when protocol demanded it. He thanked guests and accepted congratulations with measured grace. He stood beside Rebecca as though nothing had ruptured behind them, as though the sound of her name had not torn through everything he had planned. But when the last guest departed, he did as well.
By the time Rebecca realized he was gone, the doors had already closed, and the music had faded into absence. The emptiness struck harder than anger ever could. She stood there, the ring heavy on her hand, applause still ringing in her ears like a cruel afterimage. No one questioned his disappearance. Men like Justin Blackridge were afforded that luxury. She was not. His absence felt intentional, like a door closed with resolve. His office remained locked. His calendar was wiped clean. Calls were redirected. Messages went unanswered. Only instructions came through. They arrived before noon, delivered by his chief of staff with careful restraint. "Mr. Blackridge has left the state," she said. "He's requested that you move into his residence immediately." Rebecca tightened her grip on the phone. "Yes," she replied. She offered no questions. None would have softened the truth. That evening, she packed her apartment in silence. It already felt like a life she had left behind. She took only what still fit, leaving the rest, books, clothes, fragments of who she used to be. Crystal chandeliers, applause, her name spoken aloud pressed against her chest. Justin's house received her without ceremony. The staff moved efficiently, distant. Her belongings were placed in the guest wing, far from the master bedroom. Even space here was intentional. Justin did not reach out. Time passed, heavy and unmarked. Rebecca kept working. She ran his office, answered questions others avoided, smiled when required, learned not to pause outside his empty door. At night, alone in a house shaped by his presence, memory sharpened, the voice cutting through applause. Rebecca, Helena standing perfectly still, her pleasant expression edged with triumph. Her stepmother had always known how to wait, how to choose the moment that would wound most. Rebecca had lived carefully, knowing this reckoning would come. She just hadn't expected it to arrive as celebration. A ring slipped onto her finger while her past stood waiting behind her. On the fourth night, she drifted into Justin's study, city lights stretching beyond the glass. His presence lingered everywhere, in the books, the order, the walls themselves. She wondered where he was, what he was thinking, what the silence meant. Her phone vibrated. One message appeared on the screen. "Stay where you are. I'll be back soon." There was no attempt at comfort, no explanation offered. Rebecca released a slow breath and set the phone aside. Justin hadn't left because he was uncertain. He had left because he was furious, and because what he had seen that night unsettled something he didn't yet know how to confront. Her greatest fear had never been exposure. It was this, that the man who had chosen her so publicly would return changed, and that she might no longer recognize him when he did. Justin came back in the middle of the night. He entered quietly, lights low. The house accepted him as it always had, silent, obedient. Without meaning to, he walked toward her room. That was the lie he allowed himself. Rebecca slept curled on her side, hair loose across the pillow, her face thinner than he remembered. The sheets were tangled, one bare foot visible, unguarded in a way that unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. Justin stood there longer than he intended, watching the slow rhythm of her breathing, the fragile calm she never seemed to have while awake. His hand twitched at his side before he forced it still. He wanted to touch her, wake her, pull her close, and anchor himself to something real. He turned away instead. Before dawn, he was gone again, this time for the office. Rebecca learned he was back from someone else. A junior associate murmured it near the coffee machine, voice lowered, curiosity poorly concealed. "Mr. Blackridge is in early." He emerged from his office around noon, jacket immaculate, expression reset to discipline. The building seemed to adjust around him, as if a held breath had been released. Rebecca finished the email she was drafting, aligned the papers on her desk, steadied her breathing. "Good morning." Justin answered with a brief nod and walked past without slowing. The distance was deliberate. That was how the punishment began. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. Instead, he simply dismantled her day, minute by minute. Meetings shifted without warning. Deadlines tightened, then moved again. He asked for information he already had and watched her deliver it as though it mattered. When she spoke, he listened too closely. When she finished, he dismissed her with a single word. Enough. He treated her the way he treated dishonesty, with precision. Rebecca endured it without complaint. She knocked on his door once. "I wanted to send the revised figures to legal," he interrupted. and cancel my evening programs. She lingered a moment too long.
Justin finally raised his eyes. Is there something you need? The words cut deeper than anger.
No, she replied quietly.
She turned and left. The office noticed. They always did. Whispers followed her through the corridors, curious glances, sympathy sharpening into speculation. The ring on her finger became a question no one asked aloud. Justin reduced her days to process and pressure. He corrected her in meetings she once led with ease, asked for explanations he didn't need, sent her for documents already on his desk, watched her absorb it without protest, punishment disguised as procedure. And every night, he returned to a house where her presence followed him like a ghost. On the 5th evening, Rebecca went to see him in the study. She didn't knock. She entered barefoot, resignation letter in her hand. Justin looked up and lost his breath. She wore a thin linen shirt, pale and soft, clinging to her frame in a way her work clothes never did. Sleeves rolled carelessly, collar open. His gaze betrayed him. The curve of her waist, the hollow at her collarbone, the way exhaustion had stripped her down to something dangerously intimate. He wanted to cross the room in 2 strides, close his hands around her waist, feel her warmth, prove she was solid. He did none of it. The restraint made him colder.
I want to resign, Rebecca said, voice steady, and I want to call off the engagement.
He stood slowly, moving around the desk, stopping close enough that she felt the heat of him, but not touching her. No, he said. She blinked. No? You'll give 2 weeks' notice, he continued calmly, effective immediately.
Why are you doing this to me? She asked, her voice low. I'm not doing anything, he said. This is how discipline works when trust is compromised.
She stepped closer, unaware of how badly that made him want to reach for her. She placed the letter on his desk anyway. He didn't touch it. I don't break my principles, Justin said, and I don't reward dishonesty. The words landed exactly where she feared they would. I never meant to hurt you, she said. Intent doesn't change the act. Silence stretched. You chose silence, he said, and you let me build something on it. The truth of it burned. He moved past her then, deliberately brushing close without touching. You will continue your duties, Justin said, as before. As before? She echoed bitterly. No, he corrected. Better. And the engagement? She asked, his face locked. That, he said, remains too. Rebecca stared at him, confusion and hurt colliding. Why? Because he couldn't let her go. Because he didn't know how to keep her without destroying something first. Because I don't want another scandal so soon, he added flatly. You may go now. Rebecca turned toward the door, shoulders tight, heart breaking in ways she didn't yet understand. As she left, Justin closed his eyes. The revenge he thought he was delivering felt too much like self-inflicted damage. He wasn't punishing her for lying. He was punishing himself for wanting her anyway. The days that followed were worse. He worked her relentlessly, not because she failed, but because she didn't. He gave her responsibility after responsibility, leaned on her judgment, depended on her memory. He watched her move through the office like a faultless machine, and every time she succeeded, something in his jaw tightened. Because the truth he refused to say out loud was this: he could not stay away from her. At night, in the house they shared but did not occupy together, Justin heard her footsteps, the soft click of her door, the quiet hum of her presence in spaces he had once ruled alone. It unsettled him. He had hated dishonesty his entire life because it removed choice, because it stole consent from truth. And now, the woman he had chosen, publicly, irrevocably, had been hiding something fundamental. Rebecca, for her part, carried the weight of his silence like penance. She worked until her hands ached, until her voice grew hoarse, until sleep finally claimed her. And that, only that, was when Justin allowed himself the smallest indulgence. He would pause outside her door, never entering, never crossing the line he pretended still mattered. He listened to the quiet rhythm of her breathing, imagined the exhaustion pulling her under, smoothing the sharp edges he himself had carved into her days. Morning arrived without ceremony. Justin was already awake when the house stirred. Standing by the window in his study, the city stretched beneath him like a conquered thing. He hadn't slept. Not truly. He never did anymore. Sleep required a peace he no longer possessed. Behind him, the house breathed quietly. Her presence changed the sound of it. Rebecca left her room at 6:48 a.m., as she always did now. He heard her footsteps, light, careful, as if she were afraid of disturbing something fragile. She didn't know he was there, didn't know he listened for her the way one listened for an approaching storm. She passed the study without looking in. Good, he thought. Distance was still intact. At the office, he was already seated when she arrived. "Rebecca," he said without looking up, "conference call at 8. I want the full risk analysis, not the abbreviated version." "Yes," she replied. Nothing more. Just obedience honed into habit. At noon, Justin corrected her in front of the board. Subtle, polite, devastating. She accepted it without protest. Hands steady, eyes lowered. That night, she worked past midnight. Justin knew because the light beneath her door stayed on. She didn't emerge for dinner, didn't make tea, didn't pause. He stood outside her door, didn't knock, didn't enter. He listened. The house was different when she slept. Softer, less sharp around the edges. Her exhaustion smoothed the tension he'd wound tight all day. And for a moment, just a moment, he imagined what it would be like not to be at war with the woman he loved, because that was the truth he had yet to face fully. Love. The kind that demanded honesty in return. Justin didn't go to her. He went to his study. The trust documents on his desk were older than his career, buried deep, deliberately dormant, written in language meant to discourage curiosity. He read them anyway. Then the correspondence, the signatures, the dates. He stilled. Realization settled with brutal clarity. Why she lived like someone prepared to disappear. Why fear sat beneath her composure. Why she loved carefully, from a distance, like someone who understood the cost of being seen. He closed the file. Victor Monroe had never signed away Rebecca's voting rights. Helena had. By morning, Justin initiated the activation process. Voting rights don't require permission when they were taken illegally. They require enforcement. By evening, Rebecca Monroe's controlling legacy shares were reinstated, her name restored to a register Helena had rewritten by hand. Justin signed the final authorization without hesitation. Then, he went home. The house was dark when he arrived. No lights, no movement, only the low hum of a place accustomed to order. He moved quietly, setting aside his jacket, his keys, careful not to disturb the stillness. Halfway down the corridor, he heard it. The sound carried from the guest room, uneven, exhausted, the kind that came after someone had held themselves together for far too long. It was surrender, pure and unguarded. He froze. In all his planning, all his control, this was the one thing he had never prepared for. Her tears. He had imagined her angry, defiant, cold, even distant. But this shattered him. He stood there longer than he intended, the folder still in his hand, pulse tightening in his throat. Discipline deserted him completely. Control failed. He opened the door without knocking. Rebecca was curled on the bed, shoes still on, face buried in the pillow. Her shoulders shook in sharp, broken breaths. The lamp beside her remained off. She hadn't even reached for light. "Rebecca," he said. She didn't look up. She tried to speak, tried to pull herself together, but the sound fractured in her throat, breaking into another sob she couldn't stop. "I can't," she whispered, her voice torn thin. "I can't do this anymore." Justin crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees beside the bed without thinking. The folder slid from his hand onto the mattress between them. "Look at me," he said. She shook her head, tears spilling freely now. "I tried," she said. "I really tried." "I know," he said. The words startled them both. "I know," he repeated. His hands hovered a heartbeat. Then he pulled her into him, firm and unyielding. One arm wrapped around her shoulders, the other cradling the back of her head, holding her against his chest as if the world had narrowed to this single truth. She broke completely, her fists twisted in his shirt, her face pressed against him. Every wall she had ever built collapsed at once. "I was never trying to deceive you," she sobbed. "I was hiding because that's how I survived." Her voice cracked. "My father erased me because I was inconvenient. His wife made sure I stayed erased. The shares? My mother's shares? They were the only thing left that proved I existed.
Justin closed his eyes. He leaned closer. They erased you because you were powerful, he said. She pulled back just enough to look at him through tears. And what about you? She asked. I made sure it couldn't be taken from you again, he replied. She searched his face, unsure, overwhelmed. Justin brushed her tears away with his thumb, slow and reverent, as if afraid of hurting her again. Then he nodded toward the folder resting beside them. She saw her name first, then the line beneath it, beneficiary, Rebecca Monroe. Voting rights, reinstated. What did you do? She asked, her breath catching. What should have been done years ago, Justin said. Her hands trembled as she traced the page. And Helena? She asked. She'll find out tomorrow, he said. When her access fails, when her votes don't land, when the board stops answering her calls. She closed her eyes. Thank you, she said. Justin didn't answer immediately. He leaned closer, resting his forehead against hers. I love you, he said. I loved you long before I understood you, and I don't want a version of you that hides just to survive. Her breath shuddered. She leaned into him, exhausted, trusting. You're not easy to love, she murmured. I know, he said, and pulled her closer, holding her like something precious, something chosen. That night, for the first time since truth had begun circling them like a storm, they chose each other. Helena found out the next morning what it meant to lose something she thought was permanent. Her assistant's voice tightened on the phone. Systems lagging, access denied. A vote that didn't land. A call went unanswered, then redirected. Helena opened her laptop herself. The board portal loaded. Her name was still there. Her authority was not. She refreshed once, then again, hard enough to crack the screen with her fingernail. Then she saw it. Monroe, Rebecca, voting rights, active. Helena pulled the trust file. Old, familiar. The margins she had rewritten by hand. The signatures she had counted on staying buried. Victor's was still missing. Hers wasn't. The room tilted. She stood too quickly, chair scraping back, breath coming. This wasn't negotiation. This wasn't pressure. This was removal. Her phone rang. Legal. She didn't answer. She already knew what they would say. And for the first time, Helena Monroe no longer owned the ending. And that's where our story ends. If you stayed until the end, I want to ask you something. If you were in her place, would you have followed the silence, or would you have said the words out loud, even knowing what they might cost? Tell me in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who understands how dangerous love can be when power and truth collide. Until next time, the office lights are still on, and another story is already waiting.